Much, John, for that introduction. I'm amazed that you memorized all those quotes. That's really impressive. And thank you so much to McNally Jackson. I mean, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, Oscar Villalon, the managing editor of Ziziva, a few weeks ago about the difference between online events and in-store readings. And he said, well, you know, the main difference is community, right? I mean, there's a way that going to bookstore readings is kind of like going to church. And that really resonated with me. And it especially resonates with regards to McNally Jackson, which is just, you know, it's one of the most wonderful and important independent bookstores in the country. I mean, you know, I kind of worship that store, and I was so disappointed not to be able to do the event we had planned on March 17th. But of course, that's nobody's fault, and I'm just so grateful that McNally's given me the opportunity to read tonight, and to have a conversation with one of my favorite writers, Darcie Dennigan, and to introduce the Gringa to the world. Before I read, I just want to say again that if you haven't yet bought a copy of the Gringa and you like what you hear tonight and you decide to buy it, please do buy it from McNally Jackson. Even though there might somewhere out there be some website where you could get it for a couple dollars cheaper, or maybe a little faster. Actually, not faster nowadays. It's so important to support. Yeah, it's so important to support independent bookstores right now. I mean, these are businesses that, in the best of times, you know, sometimes really struggle. And for me, like, the minute I'm allowed to walk around and go downtown and go shopping or whatever, the first store I'm going to go into is my local independent bookstore. And I suspect that that's true for a lot of you. And so just try to imagine how you'll feel if that store's not there anymore, you know? So buy the Gringa from an independent bookstore, buy any books from independent bookstores, buy gift certificates from independent bookstores, help them get through this period. And then they'll still be there for you when we come out the other side. So without further ado, I'm going to read just from the beginning of the Gringa, a kind of abridged version of the prologue. So I really don't need to set it up, except to say that it is, the novel was inspired by a true story that some of you may remember reading about in the news in the late 90s, about an American woman who had been arrested in Lima in a house full of leftist militants, and was convicted of treason and terrorism and sentenced to life in prison. So this is the Gringa, and the preface presents itself as an author's note. Leonora Gelb hated America. She hated its heart and its soul, its sick mind and its flabby, diseased body. She hated its dreams of itself, its fantasies about the rest of the world, paranoid, arrogant, weaponized fantasies. And she hated its waking realities, the sprawled, filth-strewn cities and prim, stingy towns, the metastatic freeways and supersized cars, the factory farms and clear-cut hills and amber waves of subsidized grain. She hated its festering landfills and its first-class hotels, its frenzied shopping malls and all-you-can-eat buffets. She hated its fast food abattoirs and five-star whites-only restaurants, the elegance of its ivory towers and the proud ignorance of its gun-toting, flag-waving patriots. Ignorance fostered in crumbling public schools and enforced by corporate media, all too happy to dance to the hegemon's tune. She hated America's wage slaves and its business overlords, its gated subdivisions and wasted ghettos and its shared national pastimes, the gladiatorial sporting events and disgusting beauty pageants and goose-stepping parades, the idiot sitcoms and smug TV news anchors and its movies, its movies about intellectual dwarves with superior firepower who heroically, democratically slaughter everything in their path. Leonora, Leo to her family, Comrade Linda to her friends in the revolution, hated American culture as much as its gunboat economic policies, and what really was the difference? The Dirty Harrys and the Marlboro men who brandished their big dicks and dared you to read their lips, make their day. The pop sensations, barely pubescent girls taught by men to pantomime a grotesquerie of sex for money. the murderous video games and diabetic soft drinks and breakthrough pharmaceuticals to cure phony ailments the populace had to be taught to suffer, all rammed down the throat of the developing world. Safe delivery ensured by nuclear submarine, by armed battalion, underwritten by Chevron and the World Bank, and relentlessly promoted by lie after slavering lie. Lies for which no one would ever be punished. Because in America, it's not a lie if it turns a profit, not a lie if it upholds the racial hierarchy, not a lie if it oozes from the mouth of someone we admire, soldier, sexpot, self-made tyrant. When I look at her photograph, that's the first thing I see, her outrage, her refusal to believe the lies. In the shape of her mouth stretched in a wet scream, the flared muscles of her neck, I see her fury at a government without integrity, a president who deceived the world with impunity. In her piss-soaked jeans, the broken arm stiff at her side, I see her disgust with a country that would spy on its own people, ignore its own laws, kill its own children. Certainly you've seen this photograph taken at the infamous press conference in Lima, Peru, on August 25th, 1998. 3 days after her arrest. You've noted in the way she leans toward the reporters, a Doberman on a leash, her contempt for a press that whistled while thousands were rounded up, held in secret prisons, subjected to all manner of abuse. A press that branded as disloyal any who insisted upon the truth. Who hasn't seen this image, nor wondered at the small figure surrounded by soldiers with impressive weaponry against the backdrop of a foreign flag? No one who's seen the footage can forget her gale force anger, the threat conveyed by her every gesture. No one can ignore her clenched fist. But her eyes tell a different story. When I look into her eyes, small and gray behind thick glasses, open shockingly wide, I don't see the violent criminal so many have described. I see vulnerability, the pain of betrayal. I see innocence of a kind. How to explain this incongruity? To bridge the gap between that bedraggled figure and her iron fury? How to sort out the truth from the lies? It's been 10 years since that disastrous press conference. I've been asked to find the real Leonora Gelb, a task for which no one could be less qualified. The 1998 press conference was the first time most Peruvians had seen Leonora Gelb, 8 hectic minutes in which her fate was all but sealed. Raw-eyed and hoarse, she marched into the room without an introduction, turning upon the reporters her battered, vengeful gaze. The real danger to Peruvians is not the Cuarta Filosofia, it's their own government, she shouted. The worst violence in this country is state violence. Ask the campesinos whose land was stolen, whose children are dying. Ask the people whose brothers and husbands have disappeared. It was a Tuesday morning, the ragged end of a restive, clammy winter. The basement room stank of shoe polish and spilled coffee. 3 days earlier, the house she was renting in the leafy Pueblo Libres neighborhood had been sacked by special forces, ravaged, its windows blown out, its white walls strafed. They dragged the bodies of 6 militants from that house, flaunted them to reporters while the president walked through the wreckage and shook soldiers' hands. A demon, he'd called her, flapping her passport at the TV cameras, a psychopath. For 3 days, she'd been locked away while the press stoked public fury. Now she stood surrounded by nervous soldiers, their rifles at the ready, as if to sell her, to sell the idea of her. Someone who required such precautions must be dangerous indeed. But the demon was doll-sized, something farcical about her wild, wiry hair, her wet pants. In her powder blue sweatshirt and granny glasses, she looked more like a third-grade teacher than a murderous subversive. They could not match this figure to the footage the whole country had seen, the burning house, the smashed gate, smoke whirling up into searchlights like a vision of apocalypse. They did not see a monster until she opened her mouth to speak. No one can deny the terrible inequality, she said. No one can deny the racism and exploitation that keep millions in poverty while a tiny group enriches itself. Her Spanish was perfect, but her accent gave her statement a mechanical, robotic air. This country was founded on violence, built on violence. The wealthy protect their privilege. Just shut up already, someone called out. There was low laughter, a ripple in the crowd. They could see steam on her glasses, the stain creeping down her thighs. Why were there guns in the house, Leo? Another voice called, and then a deluge. Who stole the military uniforms? Leo, why did you have blueprints of Congress? Were you working with the Cubans, Leo? Is this justice, Leo cried? Is it democracy? Leo, were you the girlfriend of Agustin Dueñas? Do you work for the CIA? Where is Mateo Peña, Leo? Leo, did you know Angelica Ramos was in the Shining Path? Did you know she was a killer? Are you a terrorist, Leo? At this, she pulled up, blinking. The room took a breath. Leonora, are you a terrorist? Her eyes scanned the back wall as though looking for a familiar face. The question came again, and she licked her lips, a whole country waiting for her answer. Years later, in the forsaken silence of her prison cell, she would still lie awake, contemplating a word. She would turn it over in her mind, try to understand its nature, to find her reflection in its empty depths. Leonora, are you a terrorist? The present work is, among other things, an attempt to answer that question. It was begun in April 2008, 10 years after her arrest, trial, and conviction. It was begun under circumstances that are somewhat cloudy, even, or especially, to me. But in the most concrete sense, it began as an article for My.World, the self-styled online omnivorous media behemoth launched 5 years prior by Jackson Durst. You'll recall the site's ambitious tagline, All the News. From the start, it was a poor fit for that outlet, owing to the complexity of the subject matter and the attention span of the target audience, to say nothing of the limitations of its author. Put simply, it should never have been assigned to me, but it was, and I've done what I could. What was it Donald Rumsfeld said about going to war with the army you have? Subsequent events further hindered my progress, which is to say I had neither the experience nor the skills necessary to the undertaking. Anyone might have predicted this. Many, in fact, did, but poor preparation and a general lack of knowledge rarely dissuade the powerful once they've set their course. Quite the opposite, actually, as our country's recent misadventures once again make plain. Once fate pointed its palsied finger, there was no turning back. The story, it would seem, was doomed from the start, destined for this sorry, unsatisfying form. I suppose it's also true that my background, my obsessions and personal concerns played a role, whatever my best intentions. Detachment, objectivity, qualities natural to responsible journalists seem not to be my strengths. If they were, I might never have left the US. I might have stayed to enjoy the ongoing calamity of our own dirty war, with its unsavory protagonists and hideous mistakes. But for all that, I set out, if reluctantly, to tell Leonora's story, not my own. I set out to understand her, to say something valuable and true. I knew there was more to her than a photo, more than shocking headlines. Of course I knew. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, was what her story would come to mean to me, nor how badly I would need to see it through. Leo, are you a terrorist? In another photo, this one from 1991, she stands with the editors of the Stanford Daily on a hillside overlooking the campus. Smiling and tan, clowning among themselves, she and her colleagues are the picture of freedom, their bright futures all but visible outside the frame. The managing editor stands behind her, two fingers over her head like rabbit ears, or a peace sign. So was she, or was she not, a terrorist? In these pages, I've tried to sort through the evidence to determine what she wanted, what she might have felt. From disparate fragments and glaring absences, I've tried to build a coherent narrative, one that does justice to the history and its many victims. I've tried to keep my own feelings out of it. I've tried to consider all sides. But it's been more than a decade. The words terror, freedom, democracy, war don't mean the same things anymore. Leo, the reporters shouted. Her hesitation had made them predatory. Answer the question. A man stood on a chair and yelled, "Fuck you, Leo, and fuck the philosophers. How many of them did you have sex with, Leo? Leo, why did you come to this country? Why do you want to kill Peruvians? How are they treating you in jail, Leonora? Have you been raped?" The soldiers moved to quiet them. Leo's breath came heavily, a shadow of alarm playing across her face. Everyone waited. Just as it seemed there would be no answer, the prisoner cleared her throat. "The Cuarta Filosofia is not a terrorist organization," she said. The sudden crush caught the soldiers off guard. Tape rolling, flashes exploding. "Leo," they called out, "Leo! Is it terrorism to love freedom," she said. "Is it terrorism to hate injustice, to feed people who are hungry?" She lifted her broken arm as far as she could, the hand white and clammy and clenched with effort. When I watch the clip, I see her trying to quiet the crowd, to finish what she wanted to say. But the press told a different story, repeated it until it became its own truth. La Leo raised her fist in defiance. She made a gesture of militant solidarity. She dug her own grave. There are no terrorists in the Quarta Filosofia, she said. It's a revolutionary movement fighting to improve the lives of people who've been forgotten. She craned her neck, voice cracking. If it's terrorism to help poor mothers and sick children, then I'm a terrorist. If it's a crime to stand for workers and the oppressed, then I accept whatever punishment I'm given. And there it was, the red meat, the money shot. Every newspaper in Peru ran the photo the next morning, the hysterical savage, the white girl brandishing her fist, and the identical headline, Yo soy terrorista. It was a disaster, a kind of suicide. Her captors could not believe their ears. At the US Embassy, lawyers smacked their desks. In a room at the Lima Sheraton where they'd waited 3 days to see their daughter, David hunched on the bed and sobbed. Maxine, standing, swore under her breath. 5 days later, Leonora Gelb was sentenced to life in prison for treason and leadership of a terrorist group. The prosecutor stood before the judges in their canvas hoods and shrugged, the matter out of his hands. Senores, he said, the prisoner has already confessed. Thanks for listening. That's the opening of the Gringa. And I am very much looking forward to my conversation with Darcie, who has previously asked me some really interesting and really complicated questions about the book. And I'm excited for this, to have another crack at having this conversation with her. But before that happens, there's something kind of cool that I wanted to tell you guys about, which is that this is my third novel, but it's the first novel that has been made into an audiobook, and that is available, I believe, at McNally Jackson. So if you're someone who prefers to listen to novels while you're running or driving in your car, you can listen to this on CD or stream it. And the actor who narrated the book, who narrated the audiobook, is a fantastic actor and a fantastic narrator named Kurt Bonham. And unless I'm mistaken or there's some technical difficulty, he's here with us tonight. And
can you hear me?
Are you there, Kurt? There you are. Check it out. He's got all this professional equipment and some kind of sword.
This is where it happened.
That's where the magic happened. Because of the coronavirus, I have not gotten my author's copy of the audiobook yet. Really? All I've heard is like a 1 minute preview that went up on the audio company's Facebook page. So I thought it would be cool to have Kurt come and maybe we would side by side just kind of read a very, very short, like a paragraph or two, sort of, dueling narrations, the guy who wrote the book, but then the guy who brought it to life.
Well, I'll tell you, your reading of the author's note was great. So
I took my inspiration from you, Kurt. So we picked a passage that's about halfway through the book, and the reason that I think it's kind of interesting is because you got a sense in that prologue of the narrator, who later on in the book will introduce himself as he never actually gives his real name. He's an expat living in Peru, and his friends there all call him Andres because he's sort of he's tried to really do that super gringo thing of reinventing himself, so he doesn't want people to call him by his American or his Anglophone name. He goes by Andres because he thinks he's become a real Peruvian by living down there for a couple of years. But he's got some skeletons in his closet, and he's got some reasons that he came down to Peru, things that he was running away from. And in a section about halfway through the book, he finally just comes out and tells the reader about them. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Kurt. Let's hear these couple of paragraphs from Andres, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it.
Sure thing. All right. I was a nomad, a stateless actor, a refugee from George W. Bush's America. America, he called it, flinty-eyed, squinting. A primitive place, America, where trespasses are never forgiven, where arguments are always settled with fisticuffs, a lost eye avenged at the blade of a knife, a lost tooth repaid with your whole fucking head. America, a place without history or memory, where it's always morning, and to dwell on what you might have done last night, drunk and staggering, smashing bottles, molesting the wenches, pissing on the floor, would be a show of weakness, an impediment to your doing it again. And so when the bartender comes looking for you, or the wench's father, what you do in America, what you do if you're a real American, is stand tall, double down, put your dukes up, and spit right in the bastard's eye. We are all American, my friends in Babylonia used to say. But American? That title is reserved for the kingdom's rightful heirs, they who fear God and love Brittany, who never met an assault rifle they didn't like, who hacked their way across a continent, murdering, cheating, infecting, and torturing the natives into submission, who imposed dominion upon a hemisphere, sucked its oil and gouged its gold, poisoned its aquifers, mined its harbors, assassinated its leaders, and redrew its maps. It was Americans who named the animals, Americans who split the atom, who won the Cold War by threatening to extinguish us all. Don't give me that nonsense about equality and fair play. Americans know cooperation is a sucker's game. It interferes with profits. We have no truck with treaties, no time for old world politesse. We take what we want by force or deception. And woe unto your children's children if you dare to ask for it back.
That, I mean, I'm not even going to try to compete with that.
No, I can't hear you.
Oh, am I muted? I'm trying to give you the.
Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. Can you hear
I
me?
can't hear you. I just got a new audio interface today, and it's causing me problems. So talk, I'll be back.
Okay. But what I was going to say was I'm not even going to try to compete with that because that was fantastic, and it's a really amazing experience to kind of hear your own book narrated back and by such a great actor and voiceover guy as Kurt Bonham. So thank you so much for that. Like I said, the audiobook is for sale as CDs or as streaming, and thank you so much, Kurt, for coming to this event and giving people a little taste of that. So I think we can have a pretty cool discussion. Darcie and I are going to talk about the book, and you can put questions into the chat, and John's going to be standing by to relay those questions into the conversation at whatever point they come in. Darcie, are you there? I don't see you.
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm ready.
All right.
Yeah, I first want to say, I read your book at the beginning of March, sort of before we were all under lockdown. And, since like March 15th, I feel like I can't read a back issue of the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. I can't read anything like slightly political without thinking, but does it stand up now? Like, does it have anything to say now? And it was so cool rereading parts of your book this week and thinking like, oh yes. And I'm so glad you read the author's note, because that first line, Leonora Gelb hated America. I've been like railing on and then, it's like, there I am, like just, another like white liberal woman brandishing her fist, there's like so much in it that I'm coming back to now this week, which is great. Okay, so I was thinking as I was rereading parts this week of the Joan Didion line that writing is a hostile act. Mm-hmm. And, I think the word hostility is all over this book. The feeling of hostility is all over this book, because you have this American, Leonora Gelb, based on Laurie Berenson, and she's trying to write herself into this story of Peru, into the philosopher's story, and she's aware of that to a large extent, and she's feeling their hostility. She's also feeling herself sort of split and doubled. There's this great line where you write, she's aware of another story sliding beneath their own. So she encounters their hostility, and then there's the hostility you sort of enact on all of your characters, in the sense that, they're a stranger to Andreas, they're an enemy in a way, and then also to each other, and also to Leonora. but the way you write this book, I'm with her parents. I'm totally on their side. I'm on her side. I'm with Chosky. I'm with Marta. Like there isn't really a side I can come down because of the kinds of stories that the stories that you're sort of telling and giving us glimpses of, in the way you're sort of layering these stories. So when I was thinking more about the Joan Didion quote about writing being a hostile act, I think like she's talking about writers kind of like wrenching their own perspective on your mind, like putting their mind into yours. And that's like the one kind of hostility I don't find in this book. I was thinking today, what is Andrew's perspective? Like, whose side are you on? Do you have a personal sort of like connection to one or more of these characters? Is there a side you'd come down on?
Yeah, there's so much in that question, like so many different angles I'd like to come at it. But first I want to ask, a moment ago, were you waving an X-Acto knife at me?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a glitter gel pen.
Okay. I thought it was an X-Acto knife while you were talking about writing being a hostile act, and I was a little bit intimidated.
I left my props in the other room, so we're okay.
I mean, first of all, I love that Didion quote too, and I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about it. I mean, I think just in general, right? Like you said, the way she means it is you're injecting your perspective or the stories you want to tell into someone else's kind of mental universe, right? I mean, first of all, you're sort of thrusting out into the world something you want to say or a story you want to tell, and saying, damn it, this is worth turning off the latest episode of Better Call Saul, or putting down your Sudoku and spending hours reading my book. And there's a hostility and an arrogance in any of that. But there's also something that kind of like a thread or a motif in the novel, which is this question, and it's a very American question, I think, of sort of the ways that Americans have always taken our perspective around the world without giving it another thought. And there are relatively benign versus relatively malignant versions of that. I mean, Andres as a 30-something washed up novelist who's just sick of his country and just wants to go live somewhere where nobody knows him, and he doesn't have to think about George W. Bush and Iraq and the Abu Ghraib prison. Like he's taking himself and injecting himself into another culture and another country that he knows very little about. You might say, like, well, what harm does that do? But really, you don't read that much about people from other cultures other than America kind of, quote unquote, reinventing themselves by using an entire other country and its people and its language as some kind of backdrop, or like, piece of gymnastics equipment for their spiritual journey or whatever it might be. And then entirely on the other end of the spectrum, there's, a truly brutal and appalling history of American interventions in Latin America. I mean, dating back at least as far as the Spanish-American War and likely further. But certainly in the second half of the 20th century, America was constantly sort of taking over the stories of other countries, really hijacking their histories, hijacking their politics, and bending them to our will and needs and profits. And so while obviously I wouldn't equate, a kind of layabout jerk of an expat writer with colonialism or American imperialism, they are both sort of symptoms of the same mindset, and it's a particularly American mindset. And so when you talk about writing being a hostile act, I mean, there's lots of kinds of writing. There's writing a book, and there's also writing yourself into the story of people who haven't asked you to enter their story, right? Who want to be the owners of their own story, and all the ways that Americans have completely ignored that, as we have sort of projected ourselves one way or another around the world. There was a lot more in your question, Darcie, but that was kind of what I was gravitating to. How does that work for you?
No, that works. And I saw that someone in the audience, Nan, had a question about, why does Leora Leonora decide to go to Peru, and there's of course plenty of injustices in America. And in fact, in the beginning of the book, when she is in college, she does go to a protest with her boyfriend, and it's this great passage where she's all like revved up to like fight and protest, and then a person of color, is like assaulted by the police, and she just like escapes and goes to a department store, and so like there's this sense that like there's so much going on like on the ground in America. What does she have to do? Why does she have to go to Peru? And I'm wondering if that is connecting in my mind to this really cool detail in the book, which is that her dad gives her Moby Dick as like the book to take with her to go to Peru. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why Moby Dick, maybe a little bit about like hubris and vanity, and particularly American kind of like obsession and hubris. And
sure, yeah, Moby Dick is it's not too much of a spoiler, so I'll talk about it a little bit. Shortly after Leonora moves to Peru, a few years after she graduates from Stanford, she discovers that her parents had been very opposed to her leaving. She she's a nice Jewish girl from the New York suburbs. She grew up with tremendous privilege, went to one of the most exclusive institutions of higher learning in the world. She becomes very political. She becomes very concerned with issues of social justice. And she also becomes quite aware of the ironies and the contradictions in someone from her background trying to fight for people who are much less privileged than she. It's kind of complicated, I suppose, why she ends up in Peru, or maybe it's just as simple as saying she thinks that she can make more of a difference there than she can make in the U.S. And there's a whole string of events that the early parts of the book talk about. But so she goes over her parents' objections. She's 25 or 26 when she leaves, and she discovers shortly after she's arrived that her father has given her a copy of Moby Dick, like a nice sort of leather-bound volume, as a going-away present, and he's inscribed in it something like, "To my little Ahab, I hope you'll never stop chasing your dreams," or something like that. And so on the one hand, I will go ahead and admit that it was kind of an accident. I mean, I wanted to put a book in her hand. I wanted her father to have given her a book, and Moby Dick is my wife's favorite novel. So, and it's on the shelves behind me. So I was just looking around. I said, okay, I guess it's Moby Dick, but there really are no accidents. It was probably unconscious. Moby Dick being sort of emblematic in many ways of a particular strain of American, damn the torpedoes, do anything to exert your will upon the world, and to hell with the consequences, to hell with the effects on other people. And so I felt that it fit. And then I had the idea to have her father inscribe it. And what I sort of loved most about it is that he completely misunderstands the book, as I think many readers of Moby Dick do, as a kind of tale of daring do, as a tale of heroism. Ahab as the man who battled against nature, come what may, a sort of American archetype in that sense. And so Leonora, I think, toggles back and forth between seeing herself through both prisms, right? The novel toggles back and forth between seeing her as someone who is admirable, at least at the level of, the old cliche, really having the courage of her convictions, someone who put everything on the line to fight for what she believed. And on the other hand, someone who really stumbled into a situation that was well beyond her control, thinking that she could control it. Somebody who knew a lot less about the situation that she was getting into, and that she was getting other people into, than she believed she did. And, and had it all blow up, not only in her own face, but in other people's faces. And, I think that is really, that's always been my takeaway from Moby Dick, is the kind of tragic disaster that Ahab brings upon himself and upon his shipmates. But but there are people who read it as, you know, an American chasing their dreams, and that's how her parents misunderstood the book.
You know, so Melville, you know, he was on one of those whaling ships for a while himself, and you know, like you know, there's characters that he recognizes maybe, and um, it's interesting to me that you're writing about a woman, um, and writing like you're deeply centered on a woman, and this is your second novel that is deeply centered on a woman, and I'm just sort of interested in like what you're trying to explore with Leonora, and then what you were exploring with Calliope in Lady Lazarus. What is drawing you to these female characters, and you know, like why aren't you, like many writers are being told or admonished to do, like quote, like staying in your lane? Like why are you just taking on writing a woman?
Well, I mean, first of all, to that last point, my lane is a white middle class, you know, privileged, tenured professor. I mean, I can't think of a more boring lane. I don't want to write that lane. I don't particularly care about that lane in a literary sense. And God only knows we've had enough American novels. I mean, we have covered that lane, and I don't think we need any more books in that lane, frankly. But of course, I mean, there's huge risks when you write outside of your lane, and there are a whole lot more ways to do it wrong than to do it right. And I think one of the reasons I took 8 years to write this book is because I did it in many of those wrong ways, trying to arrive at a way to do it that felt right to me, that felt true, that felt ethical and responsible, not only in the sense of writing across gender, which, as you say, you know, probably about 2/3 of the novel is in Leonora's perspective, but also, and maybe even more perilously, writing across culture, writing across language, writing across socioeconomics. I mean, this is a story set against the backdrop of a war in Peru that lasted 12 years and killed 70,000 people, about half of them at the hands of Maoist revolutionaries in the Shining Path, and about half of them at the hands of the government and the security forces. It's a country, you know, that conflict ended in 1992, but to say that they've moved past it or recovered from it would be to completely discount the incredible trauma that everyone in that country, I mean, every walk of life went through. And the minute I started trying to write this story, I wanted to write the novel because when I lived in Peru in the late 90s, Laurie Berenson was in the news a lot, and I was fascinated and perplexed by the story. And the story stuck with me for long enough that when she was paroled in 2010, I still felt fascinated enough by it and confused by, I just didn't understand it. I didn't understand who this person was or how she'd ended up where she had ended up. And I decided to write the novel. But I very quickly came up against exactly that question, which is, you know, what business do I have writing that novel? Not only a novel in which the main character is female, but a novel which is set against this national trauma, this incredible bloodletting that Peru survived, right? And here I am, a guy who lived in Peru for 2 years, speaks halfway decent Spanish, has, you know, some pretty good Peruvian friends, but so what? It's not my story. I didn't suffer through that period. And a lot of the time I struggled with exactly that question. Like, do I have any right to inject myself into this story, to claim any kind of mastery over this material? And it really kind of tied me up in knots for a long time, until I was in Lima. I was doing a research trip. It was like the 3rd or 4th time I'd been down there. I was talking to dozens of people, and one of the people I talked to a lot was a friend of mine named Stephanie Boyd, who's a Canadian journalist who's lived down there since the very early 90s, covered the end of the Dirty War, briefly covered the Berenson affair, and I was having drinks with her, and I said, I don't think I can write the book, you know? And she said, well, why not? You've been working on it for years now. And I said, well, but who am I to write this book? You know, like, who am I? And she looked at me and she said, well, you're Laurie Berenson. And I So I said, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? And what she meant was that I was a gringo, that I was an outsider, that I was someone who thought I knew and understood more than I did, which was true. That I was taking on things that were much, much bigger than me, and that in a certain sense had nothing to do with me, that I was a kind of interloper. And so hearing her sort of draw that parallel really opened up for me a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, that kind of that thread that connects different kinds of American thought and American treatment of people from other cultures and American behavior in other countries. And so what I realized was that I had to kind of enact that in the book. I had to show Andres for who he really is, and I had to I had to show Andres being shown who he really is by the people who really had the most at stake in this story, which was not Andres and not even Leonora Gelb, but Peru and Peruvians. And to really kind of do a strange thing for a writer to do, which is to have the book come out, at every turn saying, I'm not the master of this material, right? Because this material can't be mastered, certainly not by someone from outside of it, like me. And to make that part of the drama of the book, I think, the attempt of someone to write an ethical and responsible story that at some level he has no right to be writing. Did that answer? Okay.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you do that really well. The parallel between Leonora and Andres is really well set up. But more than that, although Andres is a proxy for you, there's always a tension too when I think about it, of like there's Andres and there's Leonora, and then there's the author himself and the reader, which are all sort of like implicated and uncomfortably an outsider. I was trying to master the facts of this war, and I felt like I mastered the facts, but like I'm still like untouched by them in a way. So I think you did that really well in the book, that you're sort of like your unsuitability to write this is what allowed you to write it.
Yeah.
But I also was trying to answer that question for myself before I asked it of you tonight, and it brought me to a line I really like by the character Marta, who is sort of like the older, sort of like wiser and also more jaded revolutionary whose lover was killed, and she says to Leonora, who's just like raring to go, that the sheath is mightier than the sword. Just such a great line, and also like very like I sexualized it right away, but it made me think like maybe like you're more of a sheath sort of writer, like you don't come out swinging, you sort of like try to, I don't know, layering all these sorts of like perspectives and covering up things is maybe sort of how you're getting at something. So I'm just wondering like what that line means to you, the sheath is mightier than the sword, and if you believe it of yourself as a writer.
I don't know. I mean, I think, I did a group reading last week about writing politics into fiction, and how it's a very dodgy proposition, and a lot of us who have come up through MFA programs and teach in MFA programs, right? The conventional wisdom is you stay away from this stuff. I mean, partly because the conventional wisdom in the publishing industry is that American audiences aren't interested in it. And maybe they have a point, or maybe we're just not giving them good enough books about political issues to get them interested in it. But the other point is just that too heavy an emphasis on politics can somehow pollute the work, or contaminate it, or distract from interiority and individual experience, and all of those things that realist writers are taught is what's really important about fiction. And so this book is explicitly political, and it was always meant to be explicitly political, but I'm not unmindful of all the ways that you can wreck a book that way, which is one of the reasons why the quote that John read from David Shields that the blurb from the book where he says, you got to try to write about the state of America without getting on a soapbox, and the Gringa does that. I mean, that was one of the most flattering things I'd heard, and from a writer I respect so deeply. So, I mean, I think in real life, I am probably guilty of being more of a sword than a sheath. But if the novel comes off a little bit more subtle or patient in the ways that it takes on some of these issues, then I'm happy that it reads that way. The line as it occurs in the book is actually Leonora, who her first sort of job in the revolution is to help her publish like an underground newspaper, sort of a samizdat, that they're going to distribute to sympathizers around Lima. And she writes an editorial about how basically, like, having too many machista male leaders of these militant groups sort of swaggering around with their weapons and just wanting to blow shit up and not thinking strategically has led to disaster, and that what they really need are smart female leaders like her friend and her role model Marta. And so she headlines that editorial, "The sheath is mightier than the sword."
I see people have questions. I have one more question for you before you.
Yeah.
It's again, I think about a little bit about the parallel between Andres and Leonora, and between you and Andres. In a way, this book is to me a lot about trade-offs and also vanity. Leonora causes her parents so much pain, but to her, there's a greater good at stake. Like there's a real difference she thinks she can make in Peru. At the same time, she also seems like she has a kind of vanity that can't allow herself to accept the kind of like upper middle class American lifestyle that is her birthright. Like that, like part of her vanity is like she needs to sort of like suffer to help. Anyway, so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, of course, that reminds me of a writer's life in a lot of ways, that you're not really sure if what you're doing will matter, and it's so vain to like hope it will. But also there's a lot of trade-offs that a writer has to make, and I'm wondering how you help yourself believe that your writing is worth the time you're taking to write it and worth the trade-offs you're making to do it.
God, that's a great question. I think I just don't ask myself the question, because you spend 8 years, or I did, on this book, which is longer than I've ever spent on a book before. Most of that, you're sitting alone in your pajamas, and you never know if anybody's going to read it. And then if you're lucky enough to sell it, you publish it, and you still don't know if anybody's going to read it. And then it comes out in the middle of a global pandemic, and you're pretty sure that nobody's ever going to read it. And yet, I mean, do I regret the time that I spent on it? No, but it's also, I mean, if you're writing, I don't think I believe in writing to change the world, which doesn't mean I don't think that writing can change the world. I just think that if that's what you set out to do with your writing, you're putting a very, very strange set of handcuffs on yourself, or I would be anyway. But the most I can say about it with regards to this book, I mean, specifically the content of this book, is to say that in the same way that Andres becomes sort of fascinated with the character of Leonora Gelb, that mirrors my own fascination with the real life inspiration for the story, Laurie Berenson. In that, on the one hand, I think I said this earlier, there's something admirable in someone who says, I will do anything to fight for what I think is right. I will give up, my comfortable life. I will put my safety on the line. I will put my life on the line, which is what she may have done. And she certainly sacrificed a huge part of her life. She spent 15 years in prison, 20 years total under sentence, before she was finally released and allowed to come back to the United States. And there's undoubtedly a part of me that feels like I came from a middle class, upper middle class, privileged suburban existence. I went to a good school. I call myself, you know, a leftist thinker or someone with kind of radical ideas about things. What the hell have I ever done that comes even close to what she did? On the other hand, you know, I wouldn't condone if she did the things that the government accused her of. Like I couldn't possibly condone, you know, violent revolution, you know, and plotting to invade the Congress of Peru and abduct legislators. You know, that not only is that something I would never find myself doing, but I don't admire that. And so there's this conundrum, like, okay, so I've gone to some protest marches in my time. What has any of it ever accomplished? And did I really feel like stopping the Iraq invasion was a moral imperative? If so, then why did marching down Market Street in San Francisco a couple of times suffice for me to feel like I had done my part to stop it? Do I really think like it's a moral imperative to get Donald Trump out of the White House? And if so, where do people draw the line? And so I guess, like, acknowledging my own limitations and the fact that I'm probably never going to end up at a barricade. I'm probably never going to end up, you know, sucking tear gas somewhere. Writing a book like this was what I could do. It was what I was willing to do. I don't know if it makes an effect, but I suppose at some level it's my attempt to go farther than I'd gone before. And I guess readers decide, you know, whether it accomplishes that.
Thanks, Andrew. I, as you know, have a zillion more questions, but I'm reading some really great ones on this thread too. So maybe John.
Are we okay to keep going?
Yeah, we have time. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I got nothing better to do. So I don't have the chat in front of me, so if someone wants to read them.
Let's see. We got one from P. Orby. Based on the book promotion and the opening reading right now, I can hear how close this appears to be Lori Berenson's life. I wonder how the general reader will know how to distinguish fact from fiction. My question is whether you were in touch with her or her family and what they thought or what information they provided. And then it looks like we have one more after that.
Sure. And that's a great question. I was absolutely not in touch with Lori Berenson or her family. I make no claims whatsoever for this book to be a true account of what she did or of what was done to her or of what happened. There's nothing factual in this book about that affair that wasn't available to anyone who was following it in the news or maybe doing, you know, a little light research into old articles or interviews. I was very, very conscious from the beginning that I did not want to attempt to write Lori Berenson's story. I'm not a journalist. I make no claims to be. And I have no right to that story, and certainly no right to fictionalize it, essentially to tell lies about it. What I wanted to do was write a story that was true to the facts as I understood them and as they were told to me of the war and the aftermath of the war in Peru, and then to take the very basic outlines of the Berenson case and to just think about how that might be explored in a thematic sense, in an ethical sense, in a psychological sense, to think about some of these issues that we've been talking about. Like I said, I made 4 or 5, maybe 6 trips back to Peru during the 8 years that I was writing the book, and I spoke to dozens of people, journalists, activists, former student organizers, military veterans, people who had lost family members in the war or whose family members just disappeared and never came home from the war. And over the course of doing that research, there were a couple of times when people would say to me, you know, I know a guy who knows a guy who might be able to put you in touch with Lori Berenson. She was still living in Lima at the time. She'd been paroled, but was required to stay in the country for another 5 years. And every time that happened, I said no, because if I were to talk to her, then I knew that I would not be able to get over the ethical problem of writing a story that was not factual. That, you know, if I talked to her, it would have to be her story, and I didn't want this to be her story. I wanted to just take a very basic outline. I mean, really, for me, her story is something that I glimpse out of the corner of my eye that's very interesting to me. But then to take it somewhere that I could explore some of the themes I wanted to explore without worrying that I was telling lies about somebody. And so, you know, that was the kind of delicate tightrope I tried to walk in writing the book, and I hope I achieved it. Thanks for that question.
And I think we have one more from Sarah. Lady Lazarus, your first novel? Lady Lazarus also has a slightly incompetent or untrustworthy chronicler who's investigating an enigmatic woman. Is there something that attracts you to detracting from the authority of the researcher in your work, or subverting the idea of authority in general?
Yeah, well, that's a terrific question. And to take the end of it first, yes, there is indeed something that attracts me to subverting the authority of writers, particularly white male American writers, particularly that voice of authority, which, you know, in a certain way of thinking about it, is so central to the realist project. You know, what realist writers want to do, you know, Darcie said this at the beginning, is kind of colonize your mind. I mean, make you believe in a reality that is not true. And in doing so, they can change your ideas about your own reality. I mean, there's a reason why authoritarian and totalitarian regimes always come for the writers first. And that's exactly it, because the writers can influence the ways that people think about their own reality. And for me as a writer, I'm very uncomfortable wielding that kind of power, and I resist it when I'm reading as well. I mean, I'm much more interested in books that explore that phenomenon of what happens when we read, what happens when someone tells us a story. And if I could like draw a line between Sarah's question and the previous question, this is exactly the ethical problem that I wanted the book to be chewing on, which is to say, some readers out there might know something about what happened to Laurie Berenson. And if I were to have narrated this story from that kind of Olympian authoritative perspective that American realist writers usually take, then I would be replacing at some level whatever a reader knew about the real person with the story I wanted you to believe about this made-up person. I mean, it would be inevitable that at some level, when you thought about Laurie Berenson, it would be conflated with Leonora Gelb and wrapped up in it. And that, I mean, that's really a kind of violence to Laurie Berenson, and certainly to the Peruvians who lived through that period, that I wasn't willing to commit. And so subverting that authority, making the narrator into a kind of incompetent might be a little strong. The narrator of Lady Lazarus is certainly incompetent and kind of buffoon. I think of Andres as someone who is just really out of his depth and knows he's out of his depth and wants to try really hard to make himself worthy of the story he's trying to write, but maybe can't quite accomplish that. And so in doing that, I hoped to destabilize the world of the story enough so that it's not performing that kind of literary colonization that Darcie talked about earlier. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I'm kind of getting out into the weeds with that question a little bit.
Well, Andrew, Darcie, Kurt, and everybody who came, thank you so much for doing this. I'm broadcasting remotely from my childhood home in southeastern Connecticut, and I miss dearly being at my McNally Jackson, and this has been a very nice substitute for me. And I do hope you all consider buying the Gringa straight from us at McNallyJackson.com. We'll be doing more events like these. I can't promise that they'll all be as entertaining and informative and nice as this one. And for the latecomers, we will have a recording of it that we'll post on our YouTube channel just as soon as I make it. But thank you so much, Andrew, Darcie, everyone. And yeah, I think
that about does it. Thank you so much, John, and thanks to McNally Jackson. I don't know why this just came into my head, but we did a very half-assed Seder in my house the other night. If I can repurpose a line from the Seder, like let's say next year in McNally Jackson. Let's say this time next year, life looks like a little bit like what it used to look like, and we can all sort of get our communities back together the way that they used to be. Thank you so much, and thanks, Darcie, for the great conversation.
Thank you, and have a good night, everybody.
Bye, Andrew. Bye, John. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
You can come here now.